Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Tree School Online. It's 3 o'clock and time to get started. I'm Glenn Ahrens. I'm the OSU Extension Forester for Clackamas, Marion, and Hood River counties. And it's my pleasure to be your host for today's Tree School Online. We're going into the woods. Tree School Online is a production of the OSU Forestry and Natural Resources Extension Program and the Partnership for Forestry Education. I want to give a special recognition to the Oregon Forest Resources Institute for leading this project and to the U.S. Forest Service and the Oregon Department of Forestry for giving us a grant to cover expenses. Tree School Online webinars are offered every first and third Tuesday of the month and through this month, June 2021. So this is our last month of the season. Our last webinar will be June 15th, featuring Mike Clousey of OFRI on the subject of sustainability and certification. Please visit the Tree School Online page on the knowyourforest.org website for updates on these sessions. I've got some housekeeping details to discuss. The Zoom toolbar should be located at the bottom of your screen or in some cases at the top, and many features can be accessed there. And your audio is muted as a participant. The video is also not available. And we do like you to put your questions in the Q&A box as opposed to the chat. The chat will be used for more kind of technical issues that come up or things that aren't real questions for our speakers. And the resources that go with this program today can be found on the Tree School Online class guide on the OSU Extension site, and you can reach that from the Tree School Online page on the Know Your Forest site. There's more than one way to get to our Tree School Online resources. And immediately above the webinar description, you'll see a link to the resources that these instructors have provided. These sessions are being recorded. They'll be archived as YouTube videos and accessible from the Tree School Online pages. We're also going to be using polls. We have several polls today to communicate with our audience and learn some things about you and what you think. They should pop up on your screen in a box. And then after you answer the questions, you can close the poll. If you don't see the polls, you can check in the Zoom toolbar for a lighted button. If the button appears, then the poll should pop up when you press it. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our speakers. First is Peter Hayes. Peter and his family care for their 3 forests in northern Oregon in the Coast Range. Collectively, their forests are named Hyla Woods. And the woods, as you'll see today, more than just the trees, but also the woods from the trees. So that's part of going into the woods. In addition to basic forest stewardship, the Hayes family enjoys milling, drying, selling, and making creative use of the forest's rich variety of native tree species. Our other presenter today, Michael R. Michael began working with the family woodland owners on forest conservation, starting in his graduate work at OSU in 2002. He's worked in the Willamette Valley, in Olympia, Washington area, and has spent 11 years working as a forest conservationist at the West Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District in Portland. In April, Michael transitioned to a new position in as the Natural Resource Conservation Program Manager in the Benton Soil and Water Conservation District in Corvallis. Peter and Michael both have served on the board of the Build Local Alliance, and together have focused much of their time on forestry education related to the variety of tree species that grow in our forests and the variety of woods that come from those. Over the last 5 years, they've offered this Into the Woods class in various formats, including part of our in-person tree school at Hopkins Demonstration Forest, where you actually do walk in the woods. They regret not being able to walk through the forest with you today, but they're excited to bundle this into an online offering for you this afternoon. So with that, Michael and Peter, why don't you turn on your video and your microphones and just briefly introduce yourselves, anything more you want to say in your talk, and then we'll go back to having a poll to learn more about our attendees today. So go ahead.
Great. Well, it's an honor to be here, and thank you for joining us, and I'll turn it over to Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just say the same thing, and I might introduce myself a little bit more as I get started, but thanks for coming in on a hot day to learn about some forestry stuff.
All right. Well, with that, before they get started with the main presentation, I am going to begin a poll. So we have questions for you to learn about you, our audience. I'm going to launch the poll, and you should see that pop up on your screen. And it just usually takes about a minute. There's 4 questions, so you have to scroll down to see them all. And we start out just asking, where you're from, and also about yourself. Let's see. Oh, there we go. People are starting to vote. So, and if you own forest land, and also then Michael and Peter have questions about species of trees that you've worked with, harvested, or perhaps sold. And it usually just takes about a minute to get everyone who's going to participate. It's always good for our speakers to see who's in the audience, and particularly in this case, who's been into the woods and what kind of woods. Okay, it looks like we probably have everybody's voted. Last chance. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end the polling so we can see the results. Okay, one more, very good. All right, poll's ending, and I'm just going to share the results and talk about them a little bit. So more than 3/4 from the Willamette Valley area, and then scattered from coastal Oregon, Southwest Oregon, Central Oregon, a few from Washington, and 2 from outside of the Northwest. And as far as woodland owners, that's 60% of us are woodland owners, or about 10% natural resource professionals, and a good portion of folks who are neither a woodland owner or a forester or professional. As far as acres owned, quite a good number, 40% not owning land. That means you must be interested in wood and trees anyway. But then the landowners all across from 10 to 40, over 100 acres. And then there's a good number of larger landowners from 100 to 1,000 acres. And then to the heart of the woods question, which species have you harvested? 40%, 41% say they've harvested or sold Douglas fir. 18% said red cedar, 8% red alder or maple, 5% working with oak, and 5% with other species. But a good number, 56%, not sold wood, don't own forest land. So there's your setup, Michael and Peter. So you learn more about the audience. So I'm going to turn it over to you. And I'll stop sharing. On with the show.
Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, I'll kick things off today and talk about a few things, and then turn it over to Peter to talk a little bit more about some other things. And I'm trying to make sure that I can click through this slideshow here. Okay, it looks like it's working. So I just kind of wanted to start off by saying a few words about the Build Local Alliance. As you might have heard as part of our introduction, that me and Peter have both served on the board of the Alliance in the past. And really the Build Local Alliance, it was founded in 2005. So it's been around a while, and it's an effort to build connections between people who grow wood and people who use wood. Peter, who was around at the beginning, often likes to mention that it's kind of a ripoff of the farm to chef connection, or the local food movement, really, where we want to see local food used in the menus of restaurants or even our school lunches. The Build Local Alliance wants to see local wood getting used in local projects. So the Build Local Alliance has been successful over the years at pulling together all members of the wood supply chain, including the growers of the wood. And that's mostly who I think we have on the call today, a lot of people who grow a forest. And then we have processors, designers, makers, build furniture or build condominiums, and consumers, people that are looking for maybe just some updates to their house and looking for cool cabinets and things like that. And historically, we've done several events a year that brings this crowd together. Usually there's an educational topic, and this is kind of morphed out of that, but the class today. And, so people show up and they end up meeting each other, and they might make some good business connections where they realize that they could find a supplier of Oregon white oak or some other kind of wood that they're interested in. So there's just a little plug with our website there, and I would encourage people to check it out. When you go there, you'll see the Build Local Alliance directory, which is pictured here. That's a great place to find folks who are working with the various woods you're interested in, or maybe you're interested in buying or interested in selling.
Michael, speaking of woods, we wanted to point them to the handouts about tree traits and lumber traits right here at the beginning, so they'd have that in hand.
Definitely. So I'll tell you what, I'll show you this here. So as part of the class today, just to kind of skip down to the bottom part here, we're going to do a walk through the woods, a virtual kind of walk through the woods, where I'll talk about some different tree species growing in the forest. And then we're going to have Peter talk a little bit more about the wood that comes from those trees. And then in the end, we'll kind of do an exercise about choosing good wood for a particular project. So one thing that Alicia can share in the chat right now would be handouts that will talk about tree traits. And you can pull that up on your screen if you're able, or even print it on the side right now and look through that and kind of see some of the tree traits of the species I'll be talking about. And then the other handout that looks almost identical to it is wood traits. And if you look at them both closely, there's definitely a little bit of different information on them, but the wood traits is kind of fun to follow along with when Peter's talking about the wood here in a minute. So those should just show up as tiny URLs or some small like web links that you can just click out of the chat box to get to those. If you can't get to them and you're having any trouble, it's not like you have to have them to succeed today, but it's just kind of helpful for people if they are able to look at them. So yeah, let's just jump into it then. Oh no, let me back up actually. So really what we've done over the years with Build Local Alliance is tried to shed the spotlight on a lot of different species that are in the forest. You know, we have a lot of Douglas fir in the neighborhood here in Northwest Oregon and Southwest Washington, but there's all these other species out there too. And so we've tried to sort of put some spotlight on some of the other species that are valuable ecologically in our forest, but also really cool wood that has special uses that you can consider. So that's really what we're trying to do today with this online version of our Into the Woods class, is to talk about those things. So first off, what is a forest? Here's two common dictionaries with two slightly different but very similar definitions. And one of them from Oxford says it's a large area covered chiefly with trees and undergrowth. And then the Merriam-Webster folks say it's a dense growth of trees and underbrush covering a large tract. So these two sources have one thing in common, at least, where they both talk about not just trees, but they're talking about underbrush or undergrowth. So really a forest isn't just a bunch of trees. It's everything that comes with the forest, including shrubs and then the diverse tree species, of course, too, but also these different organisms that live out there. So of course, as we all know, all these organisms depend on different things. Newts need different things than hairy woodpeckers need. Barred owls, you see in a picture here, even fungus. It's really just kind of an interconnected web, as we realize in the forest. And so having diverse parts is pretty great. So the species I'll talk about, I'm not going to read off this list, but just to give you kind of a preview, we're going to talk about 6 conifer species and 6 hardwood species. And then the same ones will be covered in our wood section here in a bit too. So you can't really start off a forestry class in this region without talking a little bit about Douglas fir. It's certainly the king or the queen out there. You know, it's really a dominant species. We have a lot of it. And you know, there's been a lot of forests in this region that have been almost completely Douglas fir. And then even the ones like white oak forests or other kind of older growth forests usually have some sort of Douglas fir component to them. So I'm sure a lot of you know how to identify it. But one thing is, when you're out there in that sea of green conifers and you're not sure exactly what you're looking at, you know, one thing that we teach this to kids, you know, when they're really young, is this really cool Douglas fir cone that has these bracts hanging out of it. So Douglas fir is a great species out there, fills a lot of niches. And then of course it's a very useful wood as well, but Peter will talk more about that. Another species we should think about in our forest is the grand fir. So when I walked around the forest for 11 plus years and the west side of Portland, working for the West Multnomah SWCD, I would often just kind of come across branches I would see that would look like this. And this is a grand fir branch, and we would often have it in our forests as almost like an understory tree, or middle story kind of tree. They're shade tolerant to some extent, and so they can grow under other cover, but they're certainly capable of getting quite large, like you see where you see the tree trunk, or where you see the big tall grand fir kind of in between some hardwoods that have lost their leaves. So they're capable of becoming pretty dominant. And if you've got binoculars and you're not sure what tree you're looking at, if you can see these upright cones growing on the branch, that's a fir characteristic. So all the fir in the genus will have that. And fir also have multiple terminal buds. So sometimes you see a branch like I was pointing to up here at the beginning, and you'll see those multiple terminal buds. But grand fir is another great tree out there. In our region, if you see these scaly cedar-like leaves, you're probably looking at Western red cedar. And so many of you live in other parts of the state, I noticed from the poll, or have traveled to great places like Southern Oregon. You could see Port Orford cedar, Alaska cedar, or incense cedar that would look a lot like this tree. There are subtle differences, of course, but if you're walking around in Multnomah, Yamhill, Clackamas County, you're probably coming across Western red cedar when you see the scaly like leaves. And so a lot of times we see them grow in the understory because they're shade tolerant. So they're a pretty cool species that way. And that picture on the right shows just sort of a small one that's just young and growing up underneath the canopy of some fir, but they can of course be very large trees and very old trees as well. So ecologically, one thing that's kind of neat about them is that they have a lot of heart rot that gets the insects moving. And so you'll often see woodpeckers and other species trying to get in there to eat some of those bugs, even when the tree's actually relatively healthy and still growing. Sometimes you almost think it looks like a snag or a dead tree out there, and you look up and it's actually alive and doesn't look too bad when you see the canopy. So I've been kind of going in order of shade tolerance so far, and this Western hemlock is the most shade tolerant species I've flashed up here so far. And so it's a neat one that fills that niche of kind of growing up as a later successional species a lot of times. Hemlock, like the other ones I've mentioned, can become quite large over time. And you notice it in the forest by having these shorter needles and having also from a distance a pretty floppy leader and floppier looking branches. You can kind of do some long distance ID sometimes on hemlock because of that. And then those small cones are a quick way to figure that you're looking at a hemlock instead of perhaps a grand fir or a Douglas fir if you're getting a little confused out there. So that's hemlock. And we'll have a little bit more hemlock as we trend out towards the coast sometimes too. Pacific yew is a fun one. I think it's a neat one to talk about ecologically, but it's also a pretty fun one to talk about its wood properties here in a little bit. This picture that's in the top left is actually taken on Savi Island in someone's yard where there was a Pacific yew that's just been growing for a long time, kind of on the edge. And it's not really like the most typical place I'd expect to stumble upon a yew, but it's nice because it's one of the few times I've been able to step back and kind of get a pretty good picture of one. A lot of times they're going to be grown kind of gnarly growth form underneath a lot of other brush or trees in the forest, like you see in the other photo. And then you will have this single seed born in like a little red fruity kind of surrounding. I think it's called an aril, A-R-I-L. And that's a pretty unique cone or seed. We're used to seeing cones grow on these conifers, but this is a little bit different. So Pacific yew is out there. You don't see it a ton, but it's out there, and you'll stumble across it if you're looking for it. And we also see a lot of yew that's planted ornamentally in the area, but that's often an English yew. The last of our conifers before we switch to hardwoods is the Ponderosa pine. And so one aside is, we could easily talk about Sitka spruce. We've kind of skipped that one, but it's obviously a dominant lumber species for parts of the coast. There's also lodgepole pine or shore pine, Pinus contorta on the coast. But Ponderosa pine is kind of a fun one to talk about because a lot of people planted over the years in the last maybe couple of decades. And Ponderosa pine, I always thought of it as something that would grow around Sisters or Bend, Central Oregon, Eastern Oregon, and it's a dry species. But it turns out there's actually a Willamette Valley variety of Ponderosa pine. And there's been a lot of emphasis on kind of encouraging people to grow it over the last several years. Not always as a lumber species, although it could be, but it fills some interesting niches in restoration. So it can grow on really dry soil, but it can almost grow, the Willamette Valley variety can almost grow in a wetland. I mean, it can handle really wet ground as well. And so sometimes I've been puzzled in restoration projects on what we can get growing, and settled on throwing some Ponderosa pine on the site because usually it makes it through. So to jump into hardwoods or deciduous trees or broadleaf trees, usually those more or less mean very similar things. This is the red alder. And when we're in creeks or around creeks, especially in the Coast Range and Cascades, we'll see a lot of red alder around water. You can kind of notice it in that top left photo being, it's kind of got that whitish gray bark, which is often a lichen that's growing on otherwise kind of a green bark, if is what alder naturally would be. And we're seeing more of it grown lately because it's actually got some timber value to it. And so people are kind of managing for it a little bit more. And there's a whole new way to kind of think about red alder management that's a little bit different than how we would manage Douglas fir or some of the conifers. And then a big identifying characteristic on the alder is going to be those cone-like fruits that hang from it. Every property I go on seems to have several big leaf maple in Western Oregon. It's a very common tree. You can see that maple leaf on the top right. And if you're seeing a large maple leaf in your forest, it's pretty much surely big leaf maple in our region. And you can see on the top left photo, it can grow a little bit dense at times, but it's often well spaced as well. And you can see really nice, just single tree trunks at times from a big leaf maple. The photo of me that was featured on that title slide is of me trying to measure some stems in a maple clump. And those are really common in the west side of Multnomah County for sure, where we've had logging occur where maple was logged. And then the stump sprouted a bunch of new sprouts that became tree-sized sprouts over time. And we get these maple clumps. Peter may talk about it a little bit too, but maple will often have these burls like you see in the bottom left photo, which are just kind of these welts of just growth on the tree that really this kind of makes some pretty cool wood. Bitter cherry, that's one that I think around the Portland area is quite common. I always felt like it was a little more common there than in Corvallis or the Benton County area that I was also familiar with and getting familiar with all over again. But it'll fill in a lot of times in some areas of disturbance. And you see these cherries in the top right photo, which are good for wildlife. So it's got a nice ecological role. You can kind of identify it sometimes by the lenticels, this kind of like warty looking bark a little bit. And in this is a very typical view of a bitter cherry patch that I come across in my work in the forest. And if I measured all of these, I probably wouldn't measure anything much smaller than 3 or 4 inches and nothing much bigger than about 6 inches. It's really common to find bitter cherry that's pretty small, although I have measured them before at 8 to 10 inches of diameter and probably even a little bigger. So Oregon white oak, we hear a lot about it in Western Oregon and Southwest Washington. You even hear about it down in Klamath County and out into the gorge. And it's a really great species that supports a lot of wildlife. One thing that's key with Oregon white oak is it has acorns. So we don't have a lot of nut or mast producing trees in the region. And so that's one huge thing. We think of squirrels eating acorns, but humans have also eaten them at times. And wood ducks eat acorns, so there's a lot of wildlife that depend on that, turkeys. And so we've had a lot of the oak over time disappear a bit. So we used to have oak on more ground than we do now. And some of that might be that we've converted to different forestry uses like growing more conifers, or maybe we've even put in vineyards, farms, or houses on some of that ground, or grazing and things like that. We also have a lot of background where it was managed, with fire. It was by native people in the area, and we didn't always really copy that for a long time and borrow those ideas as the Europeans settled the area. And so that's another reason why maybe some of these ecosystems aren't quite as intact as they used to be. But it's common to think about oaks growing in a savanna, like you see in this photo. But really this denser oak you see on the edge on the picture on the right is more of what I'd call an oak woodland rather than an oak savanna. And that was a really common forest type as well. And it wasn't always exclusively oak. You might find Oregon ash in that forest, or even a few conifer like the grand fir pine, or the Douglas fir in that area. So Oregon ash, we're kind of moving down for these last couple species next to the river. We're in the riparian area when we're finding Oregon ash for the most part, or at least a very wet environment. And we don't see Oregon ash necessarily in the same area as we see the red alder on our coast range or Cascade streams. We'll often see it down closer to the Willamette River on lowland forests. Oregon ash has one interesting characteristic, or I'm sure it's got several, but one of them is just that it's got compound leaves, which means that this whole thing here is a leaf. And that's about 8 different leaflets that you see on the compound leaf. So that's one thing you can get a trained eye for over time and learn how to identify it. And it's also got these long samaras that are the fruit of the tree. Last but certainly not least, we have the black cottonwood. And black cottonwood grows in the floodplains along the Willamette and Columbia River and some of our bigger river systems. And it's really a cool tree. It grows quick, gets big fast, and it supports a lot of wildlife for sure. I think that it's got a lot of capability to have nice places for the cavity nesters. That's what I'm trying to say. But also, a lot of the big leaves really bring a lot of insects, and there's a lot of feeding on cottonwood too. So it's a nice tree to have in your forest for wildlife. And I like to show the picture that's in the top left there. It's a really cool black cottonwood, and that's at about 600 or 700 feet of elevation near the Audubon Sanctuary on the edge of Portland. And I kind of joke with coworkers when I'm out in the forest when I worked at West Multnomah that there's almost one cottonwood on just about every property you go to, even in those upland areas, in that region anyway. And in this property, there was 2 nearby each other, and that was it. But they can actually grow a little bit higher up sometimes than we expect them. All right. So this is my last slide before I turn it over to Peter. And this is just kind of a slide about interdependence. And I just kind of like to show it in conclusion that it's really neat to have a forest that's got quite a mix of species, because we know that all wildlife need different things. As these species die, the snags that they create can be different. This is an old cedar snag with a red huckleberry growing out of the top of it. And those last a really, really long time. Those are great snags compared to maybe some of the other species. But for the most part, as long as they're not super dangerous, just about all snags can be helpful. We see an old stump with just some fungus growing out of here. And then even the soil photo is really just here to remind me to say, when we've done some soil samples in forestry, we'll often find that diverse forests will have really great soil. They'll have a lot more of the phosphorus and just all kinds of different capacities or different nutrients that we might not find in a more simplified forest, which is really great. So the more diverse that those soils get, the more life they can support. So that's kind of a crash course in the local trees. Sometimes in the past, we've been able to walk in the woods and just come upon these trees. Hopkins Demonstration Forest is a great place to teach this class for that reason. I think we see at least 10 of our 12 species there. So that's that. We'll come back to this and give you a chance to ask questions about it in a few minutes. But for now, I think I want to turn it over to Peter Hayes to talk about the wood properties.
Great. Hello, everyone. And thank you for joining us on this toasty afternoon. And thank you, Michael. Every time I see you do that, I learn something new. So it's very exciting. So Michael's given us sort of the first half of the story is the growing tree. And my half is now for the rest of the story is thinking about the second life of the wood that comes from these trees. So a little bit about what I bring and what I don't bring and where I come from is 5 generations before me in about 1840, my relatives began on the East Coast of this country, chopping down trees, turning them into lumber, getting them to market. So now I think we're in our 6th generation. We're still at it, which doesn't mean we know very much, but over 160 years, this family's traversed a continent. And then the upper right there, you can see the lumber floating down the Mississippi from Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And just for a little context, here's generation 4 and generation 6 together in the same place. So my father and our 2 children, and in the bottom right, our daughter Molly, beginning to thin those same trees. And a little bit about what I bring is that the experience of working with 1,000 acres of forest in the Coast Range that has all 12 of those species plus a few, and running a sawmill and a dry kiln and selling that lumber has given me a chance to be kind of broad and shallow in terms of knowing all steps of the process, from growing the tree to taking it to finished product. And to be clear about what I don't bring is I'm far from an expert probably in any of this. And I'm sure that there are many of you tuned in today who know much more than I do about different aspects. And the thing we always remind ourselves is just how fortunate we are to have our lives wrapped up with a forest and trying to take care of the forest and hoping that it will take care of us. And one of the heartening things is in hundreds of households around the Northwest, our wood, probably nearly all 12 of the species Michael talked about, is part of the lives of those families. So whether it's a bridge on the Metolius River or someone's front door. So that's been very rewarding for us, and it's also helped us get to know the unique personalities of all these species. So as Michael said, we're looking at kind of the conifers and the hardwoods, and I think of it as 5 and 5, but we're calling it 6 by 6. And if you succeeded in finding that lumber traits chart that looks kind of like this, it might be helpful, but it's not really essential. But I'm going to follow Michael's lead and sort of march, probably not in the same order, down through those. And a thing to be mindful of is, in the past, as Michael and Glenn mentioned, we did this as a hands-on experience. So we could pick up this piece of yew and we could take the plane and take a shaving off of it and smell it. And so it's quite a challenge to figure out, okay, how are we going to make this thing work virtually? What are we going to do? So what I've tried to do is to make this much more than just sort of a recitation of the traits and a laundry list, but to try to make it real by giving you actual examples of where these woods are being used. And it's an invitation, as I say, to keep exploring, because I'm assuming that many of you know an awful lot about a lot of this. And what I find really rewarding is to think this is a journey that the further you go, the more you realize there is to learn. And fair warning, there is going to be a test at the end of this. Somebody asked about a certificate, no certificate, but we'll give you a little bit of a test. So I hope you're staying awake. So just some three key points that I think are important as we look through these species. And the first is that these local forests have the ability and potential to grow really remarkable wood, and that those woods can enrich our lives. So I see them less as something that I own or our family owns, but really gifts in the sense of reciprocity of what do those species ask of us in return. And that each species is really uniquely different from the others, both when it's growing and as wood. So if we're going to live well with these, it behooves us to understand what are those traits and to keep those in mind and keep considering what those unique traits are. And the last one is an idea to invite you to join me in trying on is perhaps each of these species has its own special genius. And a question, whether we're designers or home woodwhackers or tree planters, is how can we capitalize on the genius, both in terms of the living species, but also as lumber? And how do we give these trees a dignified second life? So those are sort of 3 points that I think might be worth keeping in mind. So 2 things that would be helpful is when you're choosing wood, there will be consequences. And in many cases, people are not aware of those consequences or aware of them and choose not to pay attention to them. But one would be, what will the consequence of my wood choice be on the forest? How will it affect the forest? But likewise, the second piece of that is, how will my choice of wood have consequences for the quality of the project I'm making, whether it's a table in the backyard or a house that I'm building? That both of those consequences are important. And part of our focus in this Wood Watch, Walk in the Woods adventure is to really encourage people to think about what are those consequences. And it's not our place to tell you what choices you should make, but we encourage you to think about what those consequences are and how do you align your values with your actions. And so a big part of this is, how do we keep trying to better understand what our consequences of our choices are, both on the land and for the things that we create. So thinking about the consequences on the land, on the left here, you have your purchase of wood, and just super simply put, which doesn't do justice to us, one would be is, you could say, when I vote with my pocketbook and buy that piece of wood, I'm choosing to invest in improving the health of a forest or woodland somewhere. But also there's the choice that, whether you know it or not, that your choice could contribute to the deterioration of forest land. And that's a tough thing to figure out what that might be, but we encourage you to keep that in mind. The second one would be, as a forest owner or a forest shaper, you could have the choice between growing what I might call a complete forest, which Michael's talk sort of outlined, having all the species plus, as he said, the undergrowth, or a single species, often a single age plantations. And I think there's definitely a place for a plantation, but their choices are consequences in terms of the outcome. So I was thinking an analogy might be, if you're the artist, if you're using the complete forest, it's like painting with all the colors in that palette chart. Whereas if I'm using only a single species, around here would often be Douglas fir, it's sort of like choosing to paint with black or white, a kind of a simplification. Or another way to put it, and I picked this up from listening to an architect talk about ingredients, would be if you're a cook, with the single species plantation might be, you can do great things with potatoes and onions, but cooks most often would want that full range of species. So having the ingredients of the genius of all these different species could create a different kind of outcome in terms of your product. And a thing to think about this is, who knows about these species and their traits? Who knew and who continues to know? So I think a thing that's important to keep in mind, sort of in lines of land acknowledgement, is humans have been living in this region for 10, 12,000 years. And they were experts in knowing what these species were and what their wonderful traits were. So both native people before contact, but also thinking of the pioneer farm, that they couldn't run to cross-cut hardwoods and get a piece of epay for their deck, is they also had to be very tuned into what were all the traits of these species. So just acknowledging that depth of knowledge, which is not in the past, it's in the present. And how do we honor and tap into those ways of knowing? So to run through the species, and I'll do the same Michael did through the conifers and then the hardwoods. A thing to keep in mind here is I just chose some traits: strength, hardness, appearance, smell, rot resistance, bending, and working and stability. And this matches the top column of your chart if you are successful in getting your chart out. So just to quickly run through them, is Douglas fir, as Michael said, is our dominant tree. It's really remarkable for its versatility, kind of like the utility infielder. Is its strength is medium to strong. Its hardness, and I'll explain how hardness works. It's like taking a little ball bearing tool and whacking the wood, and it's called the Jonka scale. So it's medium hard, 710. Appearance, as you all know, is sort of an orangey brown. It has a unique smell, but not easy to put into words. Rot resistance would be medium good at that. Bendability would be low. We wouldn't choose that. Workability and stability, very versatile. It can have some brittleness. And what I've tried to do here with each of these is to give an example of the use of this species. In the upper left is a picture of the inside of the First Presbyterian Church in downtown Portland, which is like this monument to Douglas fir, that almost all of it is Douglas fir. And you can see it carrying these long spans and being beautiful pews. And it just highlights all the great uses, but also this post and beam building showing that the strength of Douglas fir and its stability and its ability to create wonderful structures is really a remarkable trait. Grand fir is the often underappreciated equivalent, and its strength is medium to weak. Its hardness is relatively soft. Appearance is creamy, and I said, watch out, because I could line out 6 samples of wood for you, and they're all going to be creamy. And when we teach this course, it's really hard, even for us at times, to keep them straight. A unique thing about grand fir is loggers often call it piss fir, because when it's freshly cut, the sap that comes out has a unique, not desirable smell. Rot resistance low, bending poor, stability and strength stable, but it can also be brittle. So I use this example. This is our hut of many woods that we built in our Mount Richmond forest. And our goal was to integrate logical use of all 12 of the species. So the good use of grand fir here is it's all the studs. So we use it for all the framing because it doesn't have to be very strong when it's being used in compression. The kind of the mother tree of this region, particularly if you look back in native uses, is the Western red cedar. It's relatively weak. It's pretty soft. It's a beautiful pinkish brown. That's the ceiling in the upper picture, and the walls in the lower one. a very unique smell that I think probably any good Northwesterner can recognize. Rot resistance is really high, which is why you see it on decks and shingles and things like that. Bendability low. Workability, it's stable and fairly easy to work with. And a good example is the Cathlopodal longhouse that's a recreation down by Ridgefield. And it just shows how using this single species reflects how Native people in the past and in the present have kind of used the genius of this species, from the rot resistance of the roof to the strength of the beams. So just really a remarkable wood, and not just as wood, but as baby diapers and all sorts of other uses, 1,000 uses. Western hemlock is an underdog that's underappreciated. Strength is pretty weak. It's relatively soft. Again, it's that creamy color. Low odor, low rot resistance, doesn't bend, can be challenging to work with. Who could love it? But if you can see in this picture on the right, it's got this unique kind of glowing color, and particularly old growth hemlock. So the famous architect John Storrs, it was his absolute favorite wood because of that look of the rough sawn hemlock. And then the yew, thinking of Robin Hood, is very unique wood. Strength is super high. Hardness, it's actually harder than our Oregon white oak. Appearance, kind of this warm brown color. I've got my piece here for you to look at. Low odor, high rot resistance. And when we get to its genius, it's the ability, the reason is Robin Hood wanted it for his bow, is it has this elasticity. So the ability to bend and hold that energy and then release it. And also it was used and is used in many hand carving tools for the handles. It's this really remarkable kind of creamy, smooth wood, one of my favorites. And Ponderosa pine, as Michael said, there's more of it than most people realize, that its strength is relatively low, it's soft, creamy, but it can turn blue if the fungus gets into it. And then they can sell it for more and call it denim pine. A very distinctive smell, rot resistance low, bending poor, stability is fair. So a good use for it might be this example of paneling. Sitka spruce is another really remarkable one, and for a couple of different reasons. One is its strength to weight ratio is the best of any of our local woods, which is why it was used in airplanes. It's why it's used in oars and spars and boats. Medium hard, creamy color, low odor, low rot resistance, but also its resonance. So it's absolutely the preferred wood for musical instrument tops, and is super valuable in that application. And another favorite here is the Oregon white oak. And by chance, this counter was one of the first milling projects roughly 20 years ago in Hilo Woods, and is now the counter in the Portland Center Stage Armory Theater, a 30-foot counter made out of oak. But it's super strong, very hard. It's this kind of unique chocolatey brown color, very interesting smell when you mill it, very rot resistant, uniquely bendable. That's a hint. Yes, it'll be on the test. You might want to keep that in mind. And it can be hard to work with and dry because it tends to move and twist. But once you begin working with it, it's a fine wood to work with. So really a wonderful species for us to have in this region. Big leaf maple, as Michael mentioned, those burls on the tree that he showed. Our daughter Molly there is showing a book matched set of boards that were cut through one of those burls. And then you have the quilted maple. So medium strength, medium hardness, again, the creamy color, but I think it really stands out for the remarkable patterns that become Jaguar dashboards and Fender guitars and things like that. Low odor, low bending. So some of these have real strengths in one area and weaknesses in others. Oregon ash is, again, an underappreciated one. It's medium strong, medium hard. It has this warm golden color. That happens to be our dining room table just getting finished. And it has the ability to handle vibrations and shock, which is one of the reasons it's the preferred wood for many baseball bats and tool handles and things like that. Red alder is another one that is throughout the area. It's this classic creamy one that, how do you identify it? This is in the hut of many woods, and we use alder for all of the wood, all the walls. It was also used quite a bit for furniture at different points in time. Probably too soft to become flooring. The floor there is ash, though. Ash is not as hard as oak, but it makes an excellent flooring. In black cottonwood, people will say, well, that's the worthless wood. What could be its possible genius? So it's super weak. It's super soft. It's, again, the creamy color, kind of a low odor, worse for rot resistance, bending wood low, and it's fairly easy to work with. And for us in our forest, I've tried out this idea of the genius, and it makes excellent stickers because it leaves no color. So it's the spacing between that stack of wood. It's light, it's strong, it leaves no mark. So that's the genius for me of the black cottonwood lumber. And cherry, bitter cherry, we all think of exciting cherry tables and things like that, but mostly that's Eastern cherry. So the bad news, the good news is we have cherry, and the bad news is it doesn't have those same traits. So it's not a very commonly used lumber species here, but there are interesting uses, and it's got a kind of an unusual reddish look at times. And madrone is a favored wood, often for countertops. It's got this reddish brown look, relatively soft, but it's often used for flooring. There's not a lot of it around, and it's a beast to mill and dry because it wants to twist and turn. So any of you who've worked with it will be probably nodding your heads. So we need to stop there, but there's like so much more, and we often think we need to do a Into the Woods Part 2, and the things we'd love to talk about would be the different grades and the way the wood is cut. You can see in the diagrams how much ring count there is, the heartwood versus the sapwood, certification, Mike Clausey will be talking about that, techniques for drawing it. But the one thing I wanted to leave us with is a word for knots, in favor of knots, is that there's often a focus on CVG. I want clear vertical grain wood. And a lot of the legacy of old growth logging has been a lot of beautiful wood that have no knots. And that trees don't grow out without limbs. So it's a little bit like having the goose liver and saying we don't know what we're going to do with the goose. So the word in favor of knots is this building, the Horyuji Temple Pagoda in Japan, is still going strong after 1,300 years. And there are a number of reasons. I've just read an interesting book about its history, that it's a wooden building that is still very functional 1,300 years later. And part of it was the design, part of it was the joinery and how it's put together and the stewardship of it. But a really key thing I learned as they've replaced them is they found that the most important pieces that were the verticals had to have knots, and they got them from trees where they aligned them in the same north-south orientation that they grew as when they put them in the building. And the knots played a crucial role in helping create a building that could be 1,300 years old and still continuing forward. So think about knots, and think about, if you really care about forests, think twice before you choose old growth clear wood, and think about how we can develop an aesthetic that embraces the reality that trees don't grow without limbs. So I think with that, we're going to shift it to questions. And I think Glenn's going to pop up a poll question for you to answer, and then he'll curate questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And I'll go ahead and start a poll. So as we kick off our Q&A session, write your questions in the Q&A box, but there's some more questions from Peter and Michael for you. And I will start the next poll. And you can select more than one answer. Here we go. So let us know how you've used local wood or wood that you've grown. And even if you don't grow wood, have you used local wood, or did you know where your wood came from? And we'll go ahead and let that poll run and maybe give it a little bit of time. And maybe I'll start with one of the first questions. So there was a question from Renee, back to the qualities of the trees, maybe for both Michael and Peter. Any parts of these that are edible or medicinal, will you discuss that at all?
Yeah, so, I'm by no means an expert on all the medicinal qualities or the edible parts of these trees, but one thing that I really like is that go-to field guide in Oregon is the Pojar and McKinnon. That's the last names of the two authors that write this really great one that's got these photos in it. If you look up Pojar and McKinnon, you can find it pretty easy. And they do a lot of covering like the historical medicinal uses of different trees, which is really fun to read about, and some of their narratives on the trees. So that's something to kind of look for. But a lot of them do have qualities for that, and many of these do have edible fruits, like the cherries can be eaten by humans. But yeah, I guess I'm not. Oh, and even some of those conifers, you can make teas out of some of those tips, especially in the springtime when they're fresh, which is kind of cool as well. But I'm no expert on that one. Peter might have something to add. Give you a chance.
Yeah, Renee, I think that's a great question. And one of the dilemma of putting this workshop together and normally fitting it into 90 minutes is there's a large amount of material left on the cutting room floor. So we would like to add that, and we plan to. As Michael mentioned, the Build Local Alliance offers activities throughout the year. One is an annual celebration of cool wood projects, but another one is an ongoing series of walks in the woods with a different theme. And one that's on the drawing board that we're planning is forests as food and medicine. And we're hoping that that will work to do with our friends at the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. So stay tuned. And that's a kind of another component of what we do, but unfortunately it didn't make it in the cut for tonight, this afternoon.
All right. And actually, we have results of the poll that I'll share. Although I would point out one outstanding example of a medicinal is the Pacific yew, when they discovered that Taxol, a compound in the bark, was a good medicine for ovarian cancer. And then luckily learned to synthesize that so we didn't have to strip bark off of too many yew trees. But that's where we found it. I'm going to share the results of that poll. So you should be able to see this now. So I have sold wood to a lumber mill. So basically selling logs to a lumber mill, about 44% of our audience. A good number, 81%, have purchased local wood for a building project. As far as selling wood for a local project, that's down around 13%. And then almost 20% of folks have milled their own wood. So those are the results there, Peter and Michael, and for you all to see. And I don't know if you have if you want to reflect on that, but we've got more questions. And this was a question about bitter cherry, and you talked about that a little bit. What's the lumber value of bitter cherry? And Peter, you didn't give it a whole lot of credit. One thing I'd mention is that there's a lot of cherries that grow in the woods around the Willamette Valley that are not the native bitter cherry, but they're the naturalized European cherry we call Prunus avium. So at our Hopkins demonstration forest, for example, a lot of our larger cherries they grow faster and larger than the local bitter cherry. And you could easily make lumber, but I'm not sure about the qualities of either the bitter cherry or the naturalized European cherry.
I think that's a frontier we can keep exploring. We've milled up a fair bit of cherry, and I keep it piled in our woodshed in the inventory. And when people come through looking for wood, I try to excite them about it, but so far it's still sitting in the pile. So I think an interesting thing would be to know between the bitter cherry and the escaped orchard cherries, the traits. But like all these woods, they can be used in lots of uses, especially things like paneling. That doesn't have to be structural or graded. And as far as I know, I don't know whether you could like go to a lumber yard anywhere in the Northwest and say, I'd like to buy some bitter cherry lumber. Maybe if somebody out there knows, please speak up. But my sense is the cherry that primarily is sold in lumber yards in the Northwest is from east of the Mississippi. but room to learn.
Definitely. When I worked up in Washington State with the Hardwood Research Co-op, they actually milled cherry, and they had much larger cherry than we see down here. And the hardwood mills would mill the cherry and sell it and get pretty good value for it. And I actually milled some of my own bitter cherry. And one thing I noticed is that the wood has a highly reflective quality in certain light, some of the different phases. So anyway, explore that one. Here's a question. What is springtail? Not sure where that came from.
I'm drawing a blank.
Okay, I'm not sure. Michael, did someone say something about springtail?
Maybe there was something that sounded like that. I did not intend to.
Okay, all right. So that's maybe a moot point. Here's another one. What do you mean by stickers? You said black cottonwood are used for stickers. Explain
Yes.
that, please.
So the term in sawmill ease for a sticker is a piece of wood, usually it's 1 inch by 1 inch and often about 4 feet long, that is placed a series of them between boards, which allows the air and the heat to move through the stack of lumber to let the moisture come out. So it's a tool that's part of the sawmilling process. And what I was saying was that we've made stickers out of a variety of species, but the cottonwood, and we got there because we ended up with some beautiful big cottonwood logs on the landing and said, what the blank are we going to do with these? And we said, let's make stickers, and they've made excellent stickers. So I hope that answers that.
I think it did. Here's another question about a dream of building a post and beam house using the Doug fir I clear for the dwelling. Are there any local resources? He's in Columbia County. Resources for milling and drying, and mostly looking for advice and guidance.
Michael, do you want to take that or you want me to?
Yeah, I mean, I would just throw out there to this person who asked that or anyone else interested is it's a great idea to go to the buildlocalalliance.org website and find that directory. And as you flip through there, it's organized by section. So you'll find like a list of wood growers. And it's not like every wood grower is obviously in there, but people who have chosen to kind of get involved with the Build Local Alliance are listed. And then the next page is another thing and another thing. But eventually you'll find sawyers or people that mill the wood. And that could be a great resource because a lot of folks will do it on contract. If you can get the wood to them, they can mill it up for you for the dimensions that you need.
There's also a Northwest local timber framers guild that are very cheery, cooperative, friendly people. And so I would encourage you to connect with them.
Yeah, and definitely go ahead and email us at OSU Extension and we can direct you to some of these resources. In fact, if you just email me, that would be great. And maybe we'll put that in the chat as well. Then there's also the Oregon Forest Industry Directory, which is kind of a one-stop shopping for all the different aspects of working with wood, buying and selling that Extension maintains. So I can connect people with that. And it has a list of people with small sawmills by location as well. Is there any hickory in the Northwest?
I'd ask Glenn Ahrens about that.
Yeah, there are. Well, hickories are related to walnuts. We don't have any native hickories, but we have a lot of trees growing in cities and also trees that the settlers brought over from back east. So there are hickories here and there growing as yard trees or street trees. And also there are the close relatives. Walnut is fairly common and valuable here in Oregon. So if you have more questions about that, you could ask me, but you have to look for a street tree and maybe an urban wood source for a hickory here in the Northwest. We have 22 acres of overgrown white oak and Doug fir. Is there someone who could come out to advise us how to manage what we have for a healthier forest? We live in Yamhill.
There definitely is. One thing I'll point out with Yamhill County specifically is that one of my colleagues in the Soil and Water Conservation District world is, her name's Amy Loop Frazon. You can find her by looking at the Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District's website. And she would probably have some advice on what to do. And getting us to come out and look around is free. And sometimes we even know about some programs that can help you do what you're looking to do. but then also forest consultants. And I'm pretty sure we have those in that Build Local Alliance directory as well, just as a nice place to kind of find some names of folks that are really skilled at working with oak woodlands. So there's a lot of resources out there actually to help you. And then even OSU Extension, you can chat with your local extension agent for that.
Yes, definitely. One more question in this batch. I'm trying to keep blackberries down and at the same time plant some trees in an area with water springs popping up. What native trees do you recommend?
I can give you kind of the some advice, and then Peter's probably actually like really dealt with this and can tell you for real what to do. But a lot of times when you've got blackberries growing in wetter areas, it's a little complicated because you may have sometimes where it's harder to get in there and mow or different things like that, I guess barriers to really clear in the blackberry. But it is important to give blackberries some time with maybe a couple different treatments to really knock it back before you try to plant species. But if it's kind of wet, you could even try some of that Ponderosa pine that we mentioned that can grow in some fairly wet areas. A lot of times it's enticing to get rid of blackberry and replace it with conifer, because conifer retains its needles all of the year, or at least more of the year, to really shade out that blackberry. Anything to add, Peter?
One thing I'd add is that often there's a bias toward we need to plant Douglas fir because Douglas fir is the most valuable tree. And I think part of our purpose in helping encourage people to think about the full range of trees, and both living and otherwise, is, for instance, we've had a lot of luck planting ash into places that are those wet areas that fir just does not want to grow. And people say, oh, well, I guess you've given that piece of land for commercial value. And I always say, no way. We make much more money from ash lumber than we make from Douglas fir lumber. So I think how we shape our wood economy will reshape the options for landowners to think about coming up with the range of ecological choices that are really suited to what the land is most suited to growing both now and into the future. So I think that's part of our purpose here, is to encourage us to think broadly about those traits and how they can enrich your land, and particularly coming up with a tree that's going to be suitable to a site and do well there over the long haul.
Very good. Well, I think it's time for phase 2 of the presentation with no more questions at the moment, and I'll back out and let you guys continue.
Yeah, thanks, Glenn. So what we have to wrap up is probably just another, 8 to 10 slides, I think. And we just kind of wanted to do a little bit of an activity with everybody to get them thinking about these woods. Like Peter said, there is a test at the end here, so get ready. But just to kind of introduce it, we've talked a little bit about choosing wood, and there's all kinds of different things that would come into your decision-making process on what wood you want to use for a project. You think about things like, what's the function of this wood, and just will it do the job of what I need? You might need it to bend. You might just want a good deal, to get something done quick. There's questions about where is it available? Is it easy to get? I noticed some people on the call were from Eastern Oregon or different parts of the state. And, one thing we do on the west side is we get interested in your juniper that's growing out there. And juniper is rot resistant and really good for outdoor uses. And the neat thing with the story is that there's a lot of restoration work that happens with the cutting of juniper to make better habitat for wildlife. So when we used to just cut down juniper and leave it lay on the ground, now there are a couple entrepreneurial folks out there over the last decade or so cutting up juniper and selling it to people who want to use it for outdoor uses. So there's just all kinds of things to think about when you're choosing your wood. And that's a good lead in then to our exercise, actually. So we want to think about what lumber would be best and why for building this boat that's in the photograph here. And you're welcome to try to take a few stabs at it by putting what you think is your first choice, your second choice, and your third choice. But we hope everybody has a little scratch paper near them to just think about this one for a few minutes. And what we want to do is specifically on this boat is think about the ribs, the planking, the thwarts, and the oars. So I'm not much of a boat person. I like canoeing, but I don't know a lot. So just real quick, the anatomy of a boat. The ribs are these curved pieces in here. The planking is kind of just the part that hits the water out here, makes up the bottom. Thwarts are seats, and oars, we couldn't get down river in a good line or across a lake without them, right? So the oars are going to be our motor. So I'll just kind of pause with a little bit of dead air here for maybe 30 seconds or so, so you don't get too bored waiting around. But think about what woods we talked about that would be good for ribs, planking, thwarts, and oars. And then Peter and I will kind of lead you through the potential answers.
And while you're writing down your first, second, and third choice, I'll add to what Michael said, which is a boat is really unique because it's like a piece of functional art, and that it needs to move well, and especially if it doesn't have a motor other than a human who ate oatmeal for breakfast. It matters whether it is light, strong, well designed. So of any of the items around any region, but this region, that is discerning for your choice of wood, a human powered boat is probably high on that list, because it really matters. You couldn't build that whole boat out of Oregon white oak, or you'd never get to grandmother's for Thanksgiving dinner.
Well, let's just jump into it. We'll go to our next slide here. So these folks in the photos are working on ribs for a boat. So Peter, who has a little more boating experience than I do, what do you think would be the best one to use to make these ribs here? And what's the thought process?
Okay, and I'm hoping all of you out there in Zoom land have written down your ideas. That I have sort of three top choices, and the first would be oak, the second would be oak, and the third would be oak. Is that oak has this remarkable combination of traits, is that you can steam it and bend it to these quite radical shapes, while also being a very strong wood. But I think also there are plenty of people in the Northwest who built boats and didn't have any access to oak. So it's sort of like cooking with what you've got in the refrigerator. They must have used a variety of things. So I'm thinking like the bent willow furniture and examples of other things people would bend. I would think you could do it with yew, but also the straightness of the grain makes a big difference in whether when you steam it and bend it, it becomes your shape or it becomes a pile of splinters. So I think really the runaway champion here in history proves it is Oregon white oak is really remarkable. And it's a closed cell versus red oak, which is an open cell. And so that increases its rot resistance, which is why Oregon white oak is really sought after as a woodworking material. So putting it back to you, Michael, is we've done the ribs. So now we're going to do the planking. And I'm wondering, all of you out there, what you think might be your first, second, or third choices for the planking. And then, Michael, why don't you share what your thoughts might be there? What's your short list?
So my short list might just be one item that I was thinking of, but I'm sure there's a few things you could use. It probably depends kind of on how you were going to use the boat. But I know from my boating experience, which has usually been canoeing on the Willamette River, that I have seen some really cool cedar boats float past where people have made the canoe out of cedar. And that could, I think, also be used on this. And my thoughts on that is, I said, it is highly rot resistant, which is probably pretty nice and useful for a boat. And it's also reasonably lightweight, I think, compared to some of the other woods that are out there. And it's supposed to be stable and pretty easy to work with relative to some others. So I would probably choose cedar for this job.
Okay.
I would not choose oak for this one because I think the boat would be a bit on the heavy side.
You have to have a lot of friends to help row and carry it.
Yeah. Are there any other big winners that you'd want to consider for maybe doing the planking, or is cedar the runaway favorite?
No, I think you could probably pull off fir. And truth be told, you could probably make a boat out of just about anything if you had to.
I know a lot of the fishing boats were made from Douglas fir out on the coast in the old days.
Yeah, yeah.
The planking.
Yeah.
Thick planking, big fishing boats.
Yes, thick so it could afford to rot for a bit. So what do we have next, Michael?
So why don't you take on the oars? What would we make the oars out of?
Okay. And I'm wondering what, obviously, Michael and I would wish we were all just sitting in a room and you guys could answer, but we're faking it and doing the best we can here. But I pitched you guys a bunch of softballs saying that strongest strength per weight ratio used for oars and spars and boats. So the runaway favorite for paddles and oars from our native species would be Sitka spruce. And although having a problem with boat acquisition disorder, our boat shed has lots of other species oars in it. And for instance, there's a boat that my grandfather had built in the Depression in 1930 that still has the same Western Red Cedar oars that are very light, but a problem is being straight grained, they might be prone to splitting. We've made oars out of ash. Oregon ash is great, and Douglas fir is a perfectly good one. So there's quite a bit of latitude there. And then back to you, Michael, is the thwarts, the things people are going to sit on. What do you think the considerations might be, and what might be your thoughts on the choice for the thwarts?
Yeah, I think the thwarts are kind of a fun one because my impression, at least, is that it's probably a little less important what wood you choose here because a lot of them could probably do the job. So I would assume that maybe a cottonwood would be weak enough that if you had a heavy person in your boat or something, that it may not really hold us up that well. But the cool thing with the thwarts might be that you could think more about just what can you get your hands on and make it easy, you know? So maybe this is a place where we use our bitter cherry, perhaps, just to give it a use, since we've been talking about that in the class today. I always really like the look of big leaf maple. So I would maybe, and that's very available and pretty easy to find in our region. So I think that maple could be a good choice. But my guess, and you're definitely welcome to correct me if I'm wrong on that at all, but that we could really open up the playbook on this one and just come up with something maybe even based on easy availability or even appearance of what we like to look at.
Well, you being an educator, maybe you should have every thwart be a different species. And then as you row along, you can review all of your friends and have them close to you.
Definitely. Yeah.
And obviously with the boat here, we could go on much further, have a more complicated boat, because you can see we just picked 4 ingredients here, but there are many more just in this little simple boat. But the boat can use probably almost all of our different species. And what we're trying to show here is how those traits really make a difference in terms of the choices you might make.
Great.
And I'll just throw in a piece here is all of these pictures came from our friends at the Wind and Oar Boat School and school groups that have built a number of beautiful boats. And actually the boat in the background that was built for Tim Boyle of Columbia Sportswear on the right there, the ribs in that boat came from our Hyla Woods oak. So it's really fun to think about where the wood might go and how the wood might row. So thanks to them. And then for resources, as we said, we wanted you to continue your journey. And there are lots of ways to do that by getting out in the woods and planting a tree or finding a piece of lumber and making something out of it. But both Michael and I have really benefited from reading. And there are a large range of resources that we would encourage you to check out if you haven't. And a few here that we just chose, some of them have to do with sort of the forest as an overall ecosystem. And there's a lot that's being learned about forest and how they work and how the trees are connected to one another, but also, for instance, the fungi and the understory. So the forest is a system. And also there's a whole genre of books that are focused on a single species. We gave just a few here, but if you find your way back to where you hopefully found your 2 charts of traits, there's a list of resources, which are some of the ones we've found to be most helpful. And given that we see this as sort of an ongoing adventure, we welcome your suggestions of what we should be adding to this list, because it's just a start. But the value of the things we've been able to read and learn has been high. So we encourage you to check them out.
You know, one thing I want to add here is I said something kind of in the first part of the class today that I just kind of cringed about a minute later. And we can sometimes get in the habit of making the comment of when we got here, we did this. And I do identify as a white person, and I can sometimes think about European settlers coming onto the scene. And I by no means want to make everyone on the call feel like they also are European settlers by saying the we. And I just want to use that as just a moment to just say, you know, so much of this was learned from the people that have been here, like Peter said earlier, for 10 to 12,000 years. And so just to reiterate that a lot of what we know about these species and a lot of what we've been doing has based on, you know, thousands of years of history for sure. So with that said, you know, both me and Peter would welcome any questions that you might have about any of this. And then the Build Local Alliance is a resource for you. So please visit that website and look around at some of the resources that are there, especially that directory if you want to get into contact with anybody that's working with some of this cool wood. And with that, Glenn can let us know if we have time for a few more questions. Oh, maybe we can get to that slide in a minute, Glenn. You can let us know, but yeah,
Okay.
we're ready for questions.
Yeah, we do certainly have time for questions. I don't see any in the Q&A box right now. So while I'd like to give folks a chance to think of a few more questions. I would just ask, just to explore this more, because Peter, you've just scratched the surface with some of your stories. You talked about oak ribs for a boat that was built. You talked about the first thing you made, that long table. I'd just like you to spin a couple more examples of Into the Woods that from your experience in your family, maybe some inspiring examples of projects you've done, starting with the tree. Yeah,
and we've been milling and drying and selling for, it'll be close to 20 years. And it's resulted in both exciting projects, but also sometimes even more valuable, the relationships we've developed. So for instance, when the fires burned down through Opal Creek up the North Fork of the Sandy Am, there were several buildings that were built with our wood that unfortunately are no longer there. We've sold wood to a number of boat building folks. One that was quite strange that we just had was the people who were contracted to make the Google for the entrance to the Google headquarters in the Bay Area wanted pieces of in-grain, round 5 to 6 inch pieces of white oak. So just before the winter holidays 2 years ago, I was groveling in the woods trying to cut all these little pieces of slimy pieces of oak. And they said a good example of the ability of designers to know what they're dealing with. They wanted them all to be perfectly straight and 5 inches long. And all of us who have dealt with oak trees know that an oak tree does not go straight very, very far. So we had to go back to them and say, that's not going to work. So those are just a few of the projects. A lot of it's been flooring. And a thing we're quite excited to do is the joinery, as many of you know, is a wonderful maker of and seller of fine furniture. And early on, when we approached them about Oregon white oak, they really weren't interested in oak. But in the last 5 years, they've become quite interested in not just making nice furniture, but selling furniture that has a story that they feel good about and think that the customer will feel good about. So we've developed a relationship where a good bit of our high quality oak, which are often oak trees that have died, has ended up becoming part of the joinery furniture collection.
Another question I have, big leaf maple, which is behind red alder, the most abundant broadleaf hardwood. And you showed a photo of this amazing pattern of the quilted maple. But what's your experience with maple, and what are some of the uses you're familiar with, especially the special stuff, and where do you find that? But also, what about straight grain maple?
Yeah, great question. So a challenge is, as a landowner, is to know if you've got really valuable maple or not. And we've sold a number of big chunks, all the way the roots and everything, to the thin slicers from Indiana who come here and put it on a flatbed truck and take it back to Indiana. And it's a whole specialized world to know what's of value, and particularly as a landowner to know if you're being fairly compensated. There's a nice company near us out in the Coast Range, I think it's called Hardwoods, that specializes in specialty maple. So I think it's nice to have that variety. And a challenge is, my understanding is, for instance, when San Francisco burned in, I think it was 1906, a lot of the flooring that went into rebuilding San Francisco came from small mills in Oregon. A lot of it was Oregon white oak, but also there are old grange halls that have dance floors that are made out of maple. So in the past, we had more diverse forests and a more diverse forest economy. So there were small mills that would make use of this variety of species. And over time, that's become more and more simplified. But more recently, there's been the rise of more specialty small sawmills. So the reality is, Oregon will do well in our region with diverse forests, and we'll only have diverse forests if we have diverse milling capacity. And we'll only have that diverse milling capacity if the people who are requesting wood have an awareness of the range of traits that we can get. So it's a big interdependent system. But I think with all of these species, they have more to offer than many people are aware of. So that's one of the reasons we invest in educational adventures like this.
Here's a question. For commercial purposes, are there species that are often overlooked and better suited for small landowners, maybe as specialty lumber products?
I'll take one stab at that, and then Michael, I'm sure, has more to add, is that in a lot of things, there's this assumption that bigger is better. So a bigger scale operation is going to be more economically effective. But I think, especially in the large landowners, often they have to come up with very kind of specific silvicultural approaches that can work not perfectly in any one place, but works reasonably well across the whole landscape. And I think it's important for us who are small landowners to think about what are our competitive advantages. And one of them is we can know our land really well because there are more eyes per acre. And because of that, we can grow the species that's best suited, so we can maximize the potential. So instead of encouraging fir to struggle along in a soggy place, why don't we plant the ash or the cottonwood and have that work? So I think there's a lot of potential there. What do you think, Michael?
I mean, I don't know that I have a lot to add to that. I mean, I think that we're on a trend where, we're getting a little warmer out there. And so just really being thoughtful about the right species in the right place is going to help out with the longevity of our forests. And so we're going to have to just kind of adapt to then what we try to market as a wood product that we hope people will buy, because it is important to make some money on your woodland for a lot of us that have a need for economic return on it. I think a lot of times with this game of kind of trying to sell different species of timber, it takes a little bit of an entrepreneurial mindset of just folks really thinking about ways to talk to the right people about what they are growing and see if they can kind of find uses for it. Whereas just calling up the mill to sell them some wood is the easiest way to go, but you've got to have the right stuff that the mill wants. So if you want to diversify what you're selling and what you're growing and make it all work, I think you also have to be a little bit businessy kind of and make some connections as well.
One other analogy I'll throw in is many of us on the growing and milling side are encouraging a wider diversity, both in terms of what's planted and what's used. But the analogy is it's not unlike going to open your safe deposit box at the bank, that those businesses can only work if both keys are in the lock to open the door, like the safe deposit box needs your key and the bank's key. And that in order for these changes to happen, we need the people who are designing things and buying wood to join us, put their key in the other lock there in order to create the conditions that allow for both a diverse wood economy and diverse forests across our region. And particularly, as Michael said, with the stresses of climate, taking advantage of that adaptive capacity of a complete forest that has that variety of species, it seems like it puts us in a better position to adapt over time than if we choose to go for a simplified system where we're trusting that a single species will continue to be as productive as we need it to be.
Yeah, and I, with the clients that we work with in extension, I mean, on the one hand, the mainstream market, excellent wood markets for a lot of the products in Oregon. But if you have something special, there is an opportunity, but you have to work harder to find it. So as Michael said, you might have to be entrepreneurial and reach out more as opposed to, the people that are clamoring to buy, the more mainstream commodity. So the Build Local Alliance and the Oregon Forest Industry Directory and through extension, we can try to help connect the dots for people that want to take that extra, effort to sell a really remarkable wood product that's not maybe the mainstream. With that, there's a couple more questions. I'm going to go ahead and launch our our final poll just while folks are still here. And you can just answer that at your leisure in the background, our wrap-up poll about what you thought of the presentation and how useful was it to you. And so just answer that at your leisure. And then also wanted to put in a plug for some upcoming programs. So Michael, if you might advance the slides while we're have launched the poll. Tomorrow, we have our FireWare Fire Prepared Wildfire Wednesdays, talking about when wildfires hit. And that's a lunch program, 12 to 1. So you can find that on our extension site. And you see the ad there for that. And then there's a next Tree School Online. If you go to the next slide. This is closing out the season. As I mentioned, Mike Clousey, who's really been a strong leader for this Tree School Online from the very beginning when we all decided to go online. He's going to be talking about forest sustainability and certification at last of the season on June 15th. So with that, I'm going to go back to question and answer. How does the blue stain fungus affect quality of the wood?
I have no idea.
Well, one quality is the color. You called it the denim color, or some people find it attractive. As far as like the strength or the wood properties, I think when it is just a stain, it doesn't really change the strength of the wood properties much. If a fungus gets established and starts rotting the wood, that's another story. And with the large acreage of diverse forest already, what are some other options in regard to uses other than lumber?
I'll take a quick stab at that and tell you a little of our family's journey on that topic. Is that we know when we benefit from many things that come from the forest, whether it's mushrooms or nettle tops or whatever, so that there's a lot that could be done there. The reason we as a family have focused on sawmilling, drying, and selling wood is we felt if we're trying to improve the value proposition, the economics of our forest, make it more profitable, we had much more potential to do that with that than with other things that we could get from the forest. So we personally benefit, but we've never chosen to monetize it in terms of a business option. And I think one of the issues is we have large areas of public lands, like one of our forests that joins the Tillamook State Forest, and people can collect for free off of those public lands. They need a license in order to do it. So it means that there's very little value in the item itself, and most of the projects will be quite labor intensive. So excited about it, and it's a thing we all need to keep exploring, and there are wonderful people throughout our region who know large about all of this. It's part of the ongoing adventure and conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly always been a lot of interest in the non-timber forest products, and actually we have a lot of resources at exploring what those are. But it is pretty difficult to make a lot of sales in that department. um, but certainly truffles are one hot topic that you might look for the Tree School Online class about truffles that you could find in the archives from our recorded sessions. Are there more forests like Hopkins demonstration forests open to the public in Oregon?
Yeah, there's definitely one really large demonstration forest in a sense would even be the McDonald Dunn Forest in Corvallis that is owned by the College of Forestry at OSU. And then what is it? Is it Magnuson Tree Farm maybe with the World Forestry Institute is another?
Yeah, and that one is not open very often anymore. It's right now kind of in a transition. I think it's only open Sundays or something like that. And there are other school forests, College of Forestry forests, besides the McDonald Dunn, although those are really, they cater to recreation. They have a lot of good recreational opportunities in that forest by Corvallis. But there are satellite forests of that. They're less well known that you can look up on the College Forest site. And there's also the Metro has not so much demonstration forest, but in the Tri-County metro area, there are a lot of forested sites that have trails and access and interpretive signs. One outstanding one is where they're restoring oak woodlands. It's called Graham Oaks west of Wilsonville. It's a really interesting site where they're reestablishing oak and valley pine in more of a savanna prairie situation. So
if you're in the metro area, Chehalem Ridge that Metro owns, or even McCarthy Headwaters, or a couple of like Douglas fir forests, or more of a Western Oregon forest that we typically think of doing harvesting in really often, I guess. Like you can see where they've done some thinning projects at those places, which is kind of neat.
Another plug for the Build Local Alliance is a resource, as I mentioned, of these walks in the woods. The next one's coming up on July 27th, and they always are thematically organized. And this one's about fire and forests, but other ones coming up will be water, drinking water in forests, oak, fish and beaver. So that you might want to get on the Build Local Alliance contact list, which you can do just by going to the website. And those walks are a great opportunity to get out and visit a wide range of different kinds of forests that are nearby and each have their own unique interests.
Very good. Well, we are at 4:30, and so some folks might be leaving, but we will continue if long as questions are coming in for a little longer into overtime. But I want to thank you all for coming, and thank Peter and Michael for your presentation and some ideas about what you can find going into the woods. So I really appreciate it, and I learned some things every time. So here's another question. Where would I source seed or saplings for Willamette Valley Ponderosa Pine?
So you can get those at a few different places. There's some different nurseries around the Willamette Valley that would sell those for sure. I mean, I think that they're fairly available. I know, Shampooey Nursery, Seven Oaks Nursery. I mean, I hesitate. I shouldn't even probably be saying the names because there's probably 20 other ones I should say, but they can be found. When you're ordering them, just make sure that you're ordering them that are from the Willamette Valley variety when you're checking in.
There's also an organization that's focused on promoting Valley Pine, Ponderosa Pine. So if you just search for Willamette Valley Pine, you'll find, I think, their website.
Yeah, I think it's the Conservation Association, Willamette Valley Ponderosa Pine Conservation Association.
That's right.
Yeah, very good. Well, let's see. Are there any other questions? I don't see any more questions. And note, thanks to Alicia in the background and posting all things in the chat. So for those of you that want to find some of those links, you've got one last chance to grab things from the chat. But also, you can please visit the resources site after the fact to get the lists of things that Peter and Michael have been talking about. And of course, always contact us at OSU Extension, and also think about the Build Local Alliance for more on this topic. So I don't see any more questions. So I think that is a wrap for us. But thanks again, Peter and Michael, and look forward to seeing you down the trail.
And thank you, Glenn, and everybody else. That we were honored to participate.
Yes, thanks very much. Thanks for attending.
Thank you all, and stay tuned for the next chapter of Tree School, depending on what the future holds with respect to our ability to get together. So, all right. Thanks, everybody, and goodbye.